Introduce our second keynote speaker, Eugénie Zvonkine, who is a senior lecturer in cinema studies in the University Paris VIII and junior member of the French University Institute. Her maybe most important for our conference opus magnum is Kira Muratova, Un cinéma de la dissonance, which appeared in 2012, and she will talk about it again and show you the book cover. But Eugénie also wrote a number of books and co-edited a number of collective monographs. Among them, the book Le Cinéma Russe Contemporain, Révolution, co-edited with Birgit Boimers, and collective volume Ruptures and Continuities in Soviet and Russian Cinema, co-edited also with Birgit Boimers, right? Yeah, second off, yeah, sorry. She has also written numerous papers on Soviet and post-Soviet cinema and participated on a regular basis in reviews such as Studies in Russian and Soviet Cinema and Cahiers du Cinéma. She is currently preparing a collective book on Sergei Loznitsa with Céline Gaillard and Damien Marguet, and a personal book which is to appear very soon on excess in Soviet and post-Soviet cinema. And today we are very happy to welcome you, Eugénie, and she will tell you her topic, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Irina. And so I just want to start by thanking with all my heart both Irinas for not giving up in spite of all the circumstances and bringing us both, all of us here together. Also want to thank Caroline for her fairy internet and computer magic. And all the presenters of this symposium, those who are here today, but also all those that we heard in May and June. I must say it's very moving for me to see such a huge collective and deep thought about Kira Muratova. I almost feel like I'm revisiting and completely rediscovering her cinema thanks to all of you. I must say that when I started working on Kira Muratova, I was much more alone, and I'm quite moved to see that Jane Taubman is here. When I started writing my PhD, Jane was the only one who had written a book on her. So Jane, it's great that you're here. It's really moving. So now I will try to open my PowerPoint. Here it goes. And then, oh yeah, that's the catch-22. Because we have to, here, yes. Where should I go? This one? Yes. No. Left. Yes. Yes. Oops. Okay. It's what work. So this is the title of my paper today: the brief form in Kira Muratova's Oeuvre, the construction of a fragmented and heterogeneous universe. So first of all, I will allow myself to dwell a little on my relationship with Kira Muratova's Oeuvre, but also with herself as a creator that I was lucky enough to have met on several occasions. So as I already said, she was the subject of my PhD thesis. And in the course of my research, I went to Ukraine and especially to Odessa, where I worked in the studio archive and met with Kira Muratova and Evgeni Golubenko, who were kind enough not only to give me interviews, but also to open to me their home, as well as their personal archives. In the Odessa studio archive, I also found the photographic album of tests for the never filmed film Princess Mary. So I'm trying to, what should I do? Just like this? Yes. Oh, no. Sorry. This, yes. Here we go. In their personal archive, I unearthed, one would say, the never filmed script, Watch Attentively Your Dreams. Внимательно смотрите сны. That was, here is the image of the cover page, the emotion of the archival finding. So it was subsequently published in SRSC in the magnificent translation by Birgit Boimers, and then in Kinovические записки. And finally, I translated it and I published it with a long introduction as a book in France with Evgeni Golubenko's illustration on the cover. Afterwards, I managed to make Muratova come to Paris in the spring of 2014 to the festival Europe Around Europe, where she presented 4 films and gave a masterclass. And finally, I was honored to participate in the organization of her full retrospective at the Cinémathèque Française, which was a huge success, even though it was very bittersweet since it happened only after her passing away. My PhD thesis was on Muratova's cinema, and I was especially interested in bringing to light what appeared to me as the founding trait of her aesthetics, and which in my eyes revealed the coherence of her work process throughout her oeuvre, even though at first glance, films like 3 Stories and Long Farewells do not seem to have very much in common. So that was the image I skipped earlier. My postulate in my thesis that I later edited as a book entitled Kira Muratova, A Cinema of Dissonance, was that dissonance was not only at the basis of her artwork, but also that it was the way in which her artistic process functioned. I think this is one of my dreams and intimate convictions as a researcher, that in some happy moments when cinema history and aesthetics do not disconnect, but on the contrary, work together, what you find as being an essential trait of an aesthetics in an oeuvre is at the same time the real practical way a director or an actor or an operator or a scriptwriter proceeds in his or her work. So this was what I tried to demonstrate in my thesis, that dissonance is not only the basis of Muratova's aesthetics, but also the way she worked while making her films, from the script until the finished film. So for this, I needed, this image is just to amuse you, I needed to define what could be a cinematographic dissonance. The first to use the term dissonance concerning Muratova's cinema was Yelena Plachova in her paper entitled Dissonance about Asthenic syndrome, published in 1990. Plachova uses the term in its everyday meaning. Dissonance here stands for a nuisance, making the perception of the spectator uncomfortable, as we can see on this image. Later on, while finishing my PhD, I was also very much inspired by Irina Sandomirskaya's paper on Muratova's soundtracks and their glossolalia and dissonance. So if we go back to the first definitions of dissonance, we can go, at least that's what I did in French, as far as 1380, when Évrard de Conti introduces the term for the first time in the French language. In his definition, for there to be a dissonance, there needs to be at least 2 sounds perceived simultaneously, de 2 sons ou plusieurs, and a lack of pleasure and comfort in the listener's perception, as oreilles aspres et abominables. For those who understand French, I think it's very funny. So later on in the 18th century, authors of the Age of Enlightenment, such as Rameau or Diderot, will follow this definition and develop it. Jean-Philippe Rameau, in his treatise on harmony, published in 1722, defines the production of dissonances as a mathematically calculable phenomenon by adding to or subtracting from consonant chords. For him, dissonances are a permanent and fixed notion, since he presents a list of dissonant chords that is supposed to be exhaustive. Thus, in 18th century, dissonance is still associated with the idea of disorder, whereas the human nature is thought to be tending towards order. So the temporary disorder of the dissonance needs to be quickly resolved by a return to harmony and consonance. It is only in the beginning of the 20th century that a new definition of dissonance emerges, formulated by Arnold Schoenberg. This composer and theoretician revolutionized the musical theory with his theory of harmony, published in 1911, which is actually 1 year after this painting. In his understanding, the consonance does obey an order, but the order itself is neither permanent nor objective. It is an order that is dependent on the perceptive habits of the listener. Thus, he is convinced then in harmony of, I'm quoting, in harmony of us ultramodernists will ultimately be found the same laws obtained in the older harmony, only correspondingly broader, more generally conceived. End of quote. Once the principles of objectivity and permanence are abolished, the only measure that can be used to define dissonance is the state of the listener's perceptual habit, which determines what bothers him and what does not. Dissonance is understood now as an evolutionary phenomenon, which is defined in relation to the perception of the auditor. Based on these definitions in music theory, the definition I came up with for cinematographic dissonance was the following. Dissonance in cinema is a unique effect produced by the non-concordance or the mismatch between at least two clearly distinguishable elements, possibly of different nature. It is characterized by the disturbance of the perceptual habit of the spectator. This disturbance can be accompanied by a desire for resolution, for the disappearance of the disturbance, as it can also be by a feeling of pleasure derived from this disturbance. This mismatch includes various phenomena preventing the fusion of the elements and therefore the appearance of the dissonance. Among these phenomena, we can, among others, name the shift, the contrast, the opposition, or the disruption. So for us to have a dissonance, at least two clearly distinguishable elements must be brought together in the viewer's perception without merging together. Kira Muratova underlines through diverse procedures what we could call the differential threshold between the elements and sheds light on their heterogeneity, which makes their harmonious fusion impossible. I showed that Muratova's aesthetic was based on forming what I call blocks. Blocks are the hermetic and heterogeneous unities which appear alongside each other without ever merging. I showed that she constructed her films with shot blocks, spaces blocks, characters blocks, or else visual or sound blocks. And I think already today we had some examples of that. For instance, the two women in the Ilias excerpt who never listen to each other is one example. And of course, there are many others. I also used Schoenberg's concept of progressive dissonance to show how Muratova keeps pushing the limits of the perceptive habits of her spectators from film to film, which at least partially explains why after the unshelving of her censored films from the Soviet period, she could not remain in the grace of the Western audiences, because her first post-Soviet film, The Sentimental Policeman, was already far ahead from what she had proposed to the public in the Asthenic syndrome. And that kept happening with each successive film. This analysis demonstrates my early preoccupation with the multiple and heterogeneous universe created by Muratova in her films. I had to explain to you in some length my dissonance theory, and I'm sorry it was so long, applied to Muratova's oeuvre to better approach my topic of the day, her predilection for brevity. So I was quite stricken by this. Starting with her first feature film, Kira Muratova regularly constructs the script of her films from several short stories or several short narrative lines, rather than from one main text of narration. For instance, for Brief Encounters, she intertwined a love dialogue between two principals, two characters, I'm quoting her, and the short story House in the Steppe by Leonid Zhukhovitsky. And in the film, even though both narrative lines are brought together in the love triangle between Maxim, Nadia, and Valentina, most of the time, they are still treated in the mise en scène and the editing as completely separate. In the unrealized script Watch Attentively Your Dreams, the heroine was constantly and unexpectedly passing from the real world, not the pravda, but the real world, to a fantasy world where she would be able to create free from any social obligations. Later on, Muratova did so even more openly in such films as Asthenic Syndrome, we already discussed in length today, where the first part after 40 minutes turns out to be a film in a film. She did the same in Chekhovian Motives, where she put together two short stories by Chekhov, at the same time linking them together and clearly underlying their different atmospheres, a stuffy, poor household, and a church full of richly dressed and distracted wedding attendees, one part dominated by a motley set referential to popular and kitsch art, and the other one referential to silent cinema. Muratova even underlined this aspect through some titles, such as Three Stories, clearly composed of 3 completely separate short films linked together by common traits and an atmosphere of cruelty, we already discussed already, and 2 in 1, also obviously based on 2 different short scripts that are tied together by the location. The first one happens inside the theater while the technical and cleaning crew prepare the stage, and the second one is the content of the play performed on stage. Another surprising aspect is that she kept on making short films throughout her career, which is quite unusual for a director of her status. She filmed Letter to America, Письмо в Америку, 1999, while she could not make a feature for lack of funding. So here, it's understandable that she made the short film because she didn't have the funding to make a feature. But in other circumstances, the filming cannot be explained by the impossibility to shoot a full feature film. Thus, she filmed Kukla while the shooting of 2 in 1 was at halt. She said, we have the technical material, we have the cameras, we have the actors, we're just at a halt, let's just make a short movie. So it was really not necessary, but she wanted to make a short film in the middle of the shooting. And similarly, she used material filmed for the tuner to edit another short film, The Certificate, Spravka. This final example is the most striking in my view, because it clearly shows how she functioned as a director by adding short episodes that can either blend into a larger narrative canvas or stand alone as independent stories. For instance, Spravka is a short story that explores the character of Luba's trickster husband in The Tuner and shows that he cheats in absolutely every aspect of his life. This film shows that he pretends his mother to be dead, whereas she is not, to get to her heritage. The project Muratova intended to make in 2012 was again a collection of 4 short scripts. When it appeared that it was impossible to finance the 4 short films to form a feature film from all of them, Muratova decided to take only one of them and transform it into a feature, and it became The Eternal Return, her last film. The other 3 that I was lucky enough to get and to read, entitled The Young Girl, Девушка, The Heritage, Наследство, again, and The Realtor, Makler, respectively by Muratova, Golubenko, and Chetverkov, are really short. They're 7 pages each. So why such a predilection for brief forms? The first answer is that of the way Muratova works on set. In several of her interviews, she mentioned getting bored if everything was going according to plan, and her love for last-minute additions, transformations, and improvisations. So Ilya this morning talked about getting bored and how it's important never to get bored. So just one info, my quotes are in Russian because it's so much funnier in Russian, but I put up as an afterthought the translations in English on my PowerPoint, so I apologize if it's a bad English because it was really done at the last minute. В какой момент вам может стать скучно во время съемок фильма? В любой момент. Обычно я начинаю скучать тогда, когда все течет так, как ты предполагала. Все актеры играют именно то, что ты предполагала. Никаких сюрпризов. Or else. Вот они сделали сценочку, все прекрасно, все катится как по маслу. Я не могу ни к чему придраться, но мне быстро становится так скучно. Да я это видела 100 раз, мне это неинтересно. Как зрителя, 1 раз смотрящего чужой фильм, меня это устраивает. Но как режиссеру, который из этих кирпичиков будет делать фильм, мне этого недостаточно. Так что я, наверное, преследую эгоистические цели. Извлечь из процесса максимум сюрприза и удовольствия. End of quote. So Evgeni Golubenko also told me in our 2009 interview, Kira снимает быстро, потому что ей быстро становится скучно. So Kira shoots very quickly her films because otherwise she gets bored quite quickly too. So this is quite coherent with her way of presenting her work from the script to the finalized film as an addition of successive layers. Расчисленный по кадрам режиссерский сценарий как бы лоция для поиска актеров, натуры, интерьеров. Ездишь, думаешь и говоришь, говоришь, говоришь. И это начинает менять, обогащая сцены, решения, диалоги. Вновь найденное наносится на чистые страницы, специально оставленные в сценарии. Потом пошли съемки, и придуманное фиксируешь в особых тетрадках и прикалываешь их туда же, к режиссерскому сценарию. А бывает, придумался прямо в момент съемки какой-то драматургический поворот. Он реализуется сразу. И происходит это беспрерывно до окончания фильма. End of quote. So she is not the only one to work in this way, of course, but this clearly confirms her artistic process that consists in adding successive layers and not sticking to a plan rigidly fixed beforehand. We can see how this manner of work is just the way to construct the film through blocks, кирпичики, and dissonances. She talked about this with an evident pleasure. Но кинопроцесс, в принципе, строится на сопромате. Знаете, что это? Термин из другой области. Физики и инженерии. Сопротивление материалов. Материал бывает живым и неживым. Кино, как правило, противится и создает неудобства. Допустим, запланировали снимать на натуре. Место выбрали давным-давно. Приехали в назначенный день. Оказывается, там вырыли яму. Другое место быстро не найдешь. Начинаешь применяться к этой яме. А может быть, яма – это очень хорошо? Может, это нам помогает? Говорю, давай ты станешь с этой стороны, он стой, а вы вообще залезьте в яму. Будет гораздо лучше, чем без ямы. Как хорошо, что они ее вырыли. Понимаете, все живое. Царапается и сопротивляется. Иногда тем самым помогаю. And here I will just authorize myself to show you, I think, what sequence she's talking about. Yes, because the interviewer who heard this and wrote this in the interview had a completely different suggestion, but I'm sure it's the beginning of Asthenic syndrome. I think, yes, Irina agrees. So, or yet another example of her artistic process, which clearly works by means of sopromat, blocks, and dissonances. Victor Matizan. Вы ставите актерам... Oops, sorry. What is going on? Oh, oops, I'm sorry. Okay. Вы ставите актерам задачи. Нет, боюсь спугнуть. Он сам сделает лучше, чем если я ему объясню теоретически. В актере я люблю его натуральный характер. И поэтому часто составляю несочетаемые комбинации. В 3 историях Маковецкого с Кушнером, Табакова с девочкой. Кушнер бесит Маковецкого, который про себя думает, меня заставляют сниматься с каким-то идиотом с улицы. Но вслух он этого не говорит, хотя буквально кипит. А девочка мешает Табакову. Мать, на самом деле, Голубенко. Конечно, Кушнер начинает так орать свой текст, что Маковецкий понимает, теперь ему надо взять такую же ноту. Общий смех. И орет в 3 раза сильнее, а в результате выходит лучше, чем можно было ожидать. End of quote. So, Simone Carpentari-Messina argues, I quote, that brevity cannot be reduced to a genre or a form. However, we could argue that it can constitute an essential aspect of the artistic process. Evgeni Golubenko seems to confirm this intuition, since when in 2019 I asked him about Muratova's love for short forms, he explained it by the fact that preparing and conceiving a shooting of a short film is simpler, leaves you more freedom to improvise and add new details, and gives the director, I quote him, a different rhythm of breathing. As Andreas Gelz puts it, when applied to literature, microfiction is, I quote, a discontinuous form, the polar opposite of the totalizing form of the novel, end of quote. But he also argues that whereas many theoreticians try to analyze brevity as fragmentation, thus as still connected to an image of a coherent overview, one could analyze brevity as a conjunction of elements that do not enter with each other in a relation of narrative logic or of power ratio. And here I will completely follow what Irina was saying just before about, I think, hierarchies and abolishing them. So this is actually quite important for us, since in the Soviet cinema, starting with the Thaw, the disruption of traditional hierarchy between the hero and the secondary character, between the human figure and the set, is an essential trend. And Muratova is one of the most significant representatives of this trend. We can remember how secondary characters tend to get the spotlight in her films and sometimes even derail the fiction to other shores, and how much this used to annoy the Goskino and the critics aligned with its views. On the pages of the scenario, there appears, oh, so this is a quote, sorry. Leonid Anstam in the Дело фильма of Brief Encounters wrote, on the pages of the scenario, there appears a multitude of episodic characters only to disappear after we caught just a glimpse of them. And this is, of course, bad. And after that, the critic Nikolai Kovarsky wrote about the film. It's here. Толстой говорил, что самое трудное совместить генерализацию и подробности. Так вот, в фильме Муратовой генеральная линия не просто утеряна, а автор не ставил своей задачей строить ее. Вот почему невозможно понять, уловить пафос, центральную идею. End of quote. It would be too long here to talk about the importance of chaos in Muratova's aesthetic, but we can just state that her getting to know the big wide world is a perfect example of how overwhelming visual and sound details that enter in endless dissonances with each other are a way to postulate a new order of the big wide world, without resolution into harmony and without traditional hierarchy. We can look at the credits of the film, devoid of capital letters, to underline that, or at the ending, where, contrary to Baklanov's script, Muratova refuses to resolve the visual dissonance into traditional harmony. So here I actually was, I think it's the and the, here it is. So it's one of the final shots of Poznavai Beli Sviet. In Baklanov's script, it ends with wide skylines of the constructed buildings and the blue sky, and it's completely harmonious. It's the return of harmony. And of course, in Muratova, it's absolutely not. She refuses to make this ending. Another aspect that is linked to this refusal of traditional hierarchy and narration is the voluntarily unfinished aspect of Muratova's films. In her films, Muratova often enjoys restarting an action and interrupting it just before it ends. For instance, the mother in the first part of Chekhovian motives tried to convince her husband to give money to their son. She shouts the same line 9 times in a row. So this is an excerpt I wanted to show to you. So I must say, make this, yes, Caroline, under your control, and then this. Yes, here we go. Yes, and play, and I just need the sound to be as strong as possible. Yes, okay.
Ведь он уже не маленький, ему совестно ходить сейчас не старые времена. Ну я тебе говорю, ну хоть свитер ему купить, смотри, стыдно, ведь он уже не маленький, ему совестно ходить раздетым, да я тебе говорю или нет. Хоть бы свитер ему купить, ты что, меня не слышишь? Не слышишь, ты что, притворяешься, я тебе говорю? Или не слышишь? Притворяется, сидит. Хоть бы свитер ему купить, смотреть стыдно. Ведь он уже не маленький, ему совестно ходить раздетым, сейчас не старые времена. Говорю, ну хоть бы свитер ему купить. Смотреть стыдно, ведь он уже не маленький, ему совестно ходить раздетым. Хоть бы свитер ему купить. Смотреть стыдно. Ведь он уже не маленький, ему совестно ходить раздетым, сейчас не старые времена. Кашанка.
Okay, so сейчас не старые времена. And now I will go back to my PowerPoint, which is here. Oh, okay. This was the first scene.
First one.
Yes, the first one. Yes, great. So the spectator cannot believe that the character repeats this so many times. And especially there is the, well, I will get to this later. So he interprets this repetition as variations of the same line, which instead of having been selected, are presented all together to the viewer. It is as if Muratova was letting the spectator make the choice she faced during the editing. Even more, in the last shot, the mother repeats the line 3 times in the same shot. This sends, and all the other soundtrack disappears at this point. This sends the viewer back to the filming technique, having the actor repeat the same line several times without cutting in order to obtain the correct intonation or performance. Between each repetition of the lines, we see the actress falling silent, looking absent and focused before attacking the line again. So we really feel like we're seeing the shooting of the movie rather than the movie itself. So of course, this refusal to select is a real choice. This is how in Asthenic syndrome, the 2 Mashas appeared. During the casting, the filmmaker couldn't decide between 2 actresses, a blonde and a brunette. Oh no, sorry, so this is, oh. no, okay, I don't know where it is. Oh, here they are. So a blonde and a brunette, and so she decided to keep them both. The second Masha, the brunette Masha, which is Natalia Busko. Yes, of course, the two Irinas. We couldn't select the better one, even if we were forced to. So the only thing you don't do that they do speak in chorus. So this you have to train a little bit for this, I think. So they repeat the same lines, thus letting the viewer appreciate the diversity of their performances. This way of working also accentuates the impression of blocks I already talked about. The line shouted by the mother appears as a block, and so do the two Mashas, who form a quite surprising character block composed of two actresses. In his paper La Cinéma, François Lyotard defines cinematographic staging as a series of exclusions. The refusal of selection, the refusal to exclude different possibilities in Kirill Muratova's films, leads to the disturbance of the presupposed order of the filmic object, because she accepts inside it what Lyotard calls as the fortuitous, the dirty, the disturbing, the poorly organized, the shifting. So now again, we can see how it connects with the marginal characters. It is not insignificant that Lyotard in the same text mentioned a possible, I quote, association for the safeguarding of rushes and the rehabilitation of film scraps, in which I think Muratova would have a rightful place. She says, I quote, "It's my passion to use all the takes. I like to use all the takes. Sometimes it just happens because I like to use all the takes, and sometimes because I can't decide which take I like best." So this is what she told to me in my first interview with her in 2009. This passion for revealing in the film all that is unfinished is part of the global movement of the cinema, manifested in the new waves all over the world. But in the case of Muratova, it perhaps also comes from the personal history of the filmmaker, whose films were banned during Soviet period. So now I have to go back because oh no, sorry. Here. В советское время после долгих проводов стало абсолютно ясно, что какой бы фильм я ни сделала, его обязательно будут ругать. И я стала так мечтать, что давайте я буду снимать, а вы их складывайте куда-нибудь. И не показывайте, и не смотрите. Просто дайте мне этим заниматься. Я же такие дешевые фильмы снимаю, они недорого вам стоят. Я очень долго жила в таком понятии, что мои фильмы должны лежать где-то в подвале. Их никто не должен смотреть. Такой вид существования меня абсолютно устраивал. End of quote. Thus, the process of making was more important than finishing. This idea is brought to its pinnacle in her last film, of course, Eternal Return, Вечное возвращение, since the film is mainly composed of variations around the same sequences performed by different actors. These variations in a chiseled black and white are followed by the final sequence in color. We are in a screening room where the producer shows these essays to an investor. The director died without being able to complete the film, and the producer is looking for money to finalize it. The investor is flattered. He is an industrialist who works in sugar industry. That's all Muratova humor. But he refuses in a very Muratovian way. My answer is negative, although not definitive. The film will therefore never be completed. Treating the spectator as her equal, Muratova invites him into the editing room and offers him to enter the game with her by composing and decomposing fictional snatches whose ideal, finished destination no longer exists. But at the same time, one could argue that this love for brevity, unfinished forms, and endless layering of dissonant elements and details are not just a refusal of the finished and large form, as the short story would be in opposition to the novel in literature, but an original way to make us experience in art the complexity and diversity of the universe. Remember the famous monologue by Nathalie Liblé in Change of Fate. I think you heard it already in this conference, not today, but previously. Множество противоречащих друг другу вещей чудесно вмещается во Вселенной. Мир велик, и его разнообразие мне нравится. Все равно как зоопарк. Одни в чешуе, другие в иглах, третьи под водой дышат. Одни едят друг друга, другие траву, а четвертые такие маленькие, что их вообще глазами не видно. И нет ни одного такого зверя, который был бы правильным зверем, эталоном. This idea is echoed by one of the main characters of her last unrealized script, Девушка, who says, «Мне очень понравилась моя работа. Я усталый просто, непривычно. Столько всяких вещей, к которым я имею отношение и которые имеют отношение ко мне, и никак пока не могу заняться чем-нибудь одним. Делаю одно, думаю о другом. Не могу полностью отдаться одному какому-нибудь занятию. Слишком много компонентов. Устаешь от этого. Надо привыкнуть. Но мне очень интересно». End of quote. Since we do not know what kind of job he is talking about, this could look as a metaphor of life, or maybe of filmmaking, as I already described it earlier. Thus, it appears that Muratova's love of brief and discontinued forms is completely coherent with her aesthetics of dissonance, narrative digressions, and representing the world as a heterogeneous ensemble, where a passing character can become the main character for a scene or two before completely disappearing from the fiction. Her aesthetics and narrative system appear to be sometimes on the Barthian side of microfiction, where the narration is, I quote, a pure continuity of interruptions, end of quote, and sometimes on the fractal side of it, where each fragment is equally important and does not need to be connected to the rest in any other way than through a repetition of forms. For instance, Pravka can completely work as a kind of miniature tuner, and it works on itself, in itself, even though it was supposed to be just a sequence from a feature film. The cinematographic gesture is posed by Muratova as an unfinished gesture whose beauty is in its brevity and in its incompleteness. And now, of course, I'm thinking about любопытство and the wonder that Irina talked earlier about. Its task is neither to give us a clear and synthetic picture of the world, nor even to tell us a flawless story, but to offer us an experience of vision and perception, which keeps its share of mystery and uncertainty until the end. And to conclude, I will read out the end of Девушка, which it seems to me perfectly illustrates everything that I said today, and actually quite finally connects with, I think, your comparison that you made this morning, Ilya. You will maybe comment on that. So here it goes. Он ловит губами ее пальцы, целует их, продолжая слушать. Потом они долго молчат, положив голову друг другу на плечи. Изредка он или она изменяют позу и снова, заглянув в глаза друг другу, смежают веки и молчат серьезно, проникновенно, слушая волны, слушая бег времени, слушая дыхание друг друга. А вокруг полупустынный весенний пляж. Людей немного, одеты по-разному. Кто в зимнем, кто в летнем. Люди тянутся к первому весеннему солнцу. Они осторожны, боятся простудиться. Сняли пальто, закатали рукава, расстегнули верхние пуговицы рубашек, жакетов, платьев. Другие в физкультурных костюмах и занимаются гимнастикой. Смелые купаются. Люди трогательны в этом своем пугливом желании тепла, яркости света, летней непринужденности поз и движений. Потом Надя открывает замки и молнии своей сумки и вынимает что-то завернутое в косынку с цветочным узором. Кладет узелок на песок. Юноша развязывает узелок, разворачивает и разглаживает косынку. В ней 2 пистолета лежат рядышком. «Сейчас?» – спрашивает юноша. «Когда?» «Сейчас», – говорит Надя. «Сейчас так, Надя? Сейчас так хорошо?» «Так хорошо. На счет 3. Я считаю». Они берут пистолеты, прижимают друг другу к вискам, прижимаются щеками друг к другу. 1, 2, 3. Грохот и вспышка взорвали и растерзали их. And just one illustration that I think is very interesting to put in perspective with this final part of the final script by Muratova. Thank you so much, and I'm ready for discussion.
Thank you, Eugénie, very much for your talk. I was so happy to hear Kira Muratova's intonations in your quotes. And I'm also happy that you brought up this, one of my favorite films by Muratova, Chekhovian motifs, with this fantastic sequence of repetition. I think it was 11 or 12 times, I counted once. We are going to open the discussion. If you have questions also in Zoom, you can, you're able actually to speak aloud or to write your question in the chat. But you can also, we can hear you and we can maybe communicate like that. So just think about your questions. I'm keeping my pulse on it. Yes, I have the yeah. Questions from the audience probably first. Yes, by the way, can you please come here because of our Zoom audience. There's a camera here.
Thank you a lot. Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. I actually was specifically interested in the concept of block. Yeah, from the French philosophy, we know it's a famous concept by Deleuze and Guattari, I think, right? Blocks of sensation, like different variations. I think it occurs in many texts. So yeah, I was interested on the one side how you relate to Deleuze philosophy generally, and on the other side maybe also, let's formulate it as a separate question. So so I understood your proposal as an aesthetic theory in the first place. I would be interested in the, let's say in the further dimension, how would you relate political, social, and historical reality of the films to this aesthetic theory or specific aesthetic of the small form, but also this dissonance, polyphonic effects, blocks, etc. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's great questions. Actually, when I was initially elaborating my concept of block, it was really very much based on pure observation of the way the films work. So I did not really use Deleuze for this, even though, of course, it's a very interesting concept also. What interested me was this kind of idea that things were not interpenetrating each other. For instance, like image about something sound completely about something else. This idea that things are entering in shock and in collision, yes, and creating this kind of disturbance. So this was when I came up with this term, it was just a way of describing this kind of quality of these elements. But then I must also say that when I found this quote about Kirpichiki, well, that's just as a joke a little bit, but also it shows that she does think this way. So she does think that she is not constructing something like the opus magnum, but she is like putting bricks on each other. So we could say bricks and not blocks, for instance. I think it would work also. Well, my theory is not purely aesthetic, because my main idea, maybe I was not successful in conveying it, but is that what I find as being a founding aesthetic basis of her work, for me, is also a very practical aspect of how she does think and construct her films, how she works on the set with the actors, with how she works in post-synchronization in sound, every new element added to be disturbant with the previous one or with the simultaneous one. So, but you're absolutely right. Of course, the context is extremely important. And that was one of the reasons why I initially wanted to work on the whole Oeuvre, because at least in France, it was very true that people tended to know only her Soviet period films, which are still very much contained in the Soviet norms, even though now we're celebrating how innovative and different they are, but they're still very much contained in several norms, narrative norms and production norms. And then after the end of the Soviet period, the scenery completely changes. So how can we explain that still it is the same aesthetic? How can we explain that the films seem so different, Три истории and Короткие встречи? If you show it to someone who doesn't know Muratova at all, he will not necessarily be able to guess that it's the same director. But when we know her over we can see how it progresses. So there came the idea of progressive dissonance. So all the time pushing our perceptive habits. So in the Soviet period, she's resisting to the Soviet norm. And then in the post-Soviet period, she will be resisting other kind of norms, and she will also interiorize some of them. For instance, I think her turn to the genre cinema is a way of internalizing some of the formal constraints she experienced in the Soviet period. So because in her first films before the start of perestroika, she never uses at all any aspect that would be resembling to genre cinema. And then she starts in Перемена участи, and then she goes even further with Чувствительный милиционер, Три истории, etc. So I think that, of course, we can see how it evolves inside the in reaction also, or inside the system of the socioeconomic context. And then also, I think it's a way of resisting. So I think it's a very interesting idea that you're expressing about the brief form also as a way of resisting. So for instance, I took the example of Brief Encounters, where she puts two short stories together and she makes a feature film. But in Долгие проводы, it's the contrary. She takes a full feature film script by Наталья Рязанцева, and what does she say about it? She says, я его взяла и стала ломать его так, как мне было надо. So I took it and started to break it up as I needed it. So I agree that it's a form of resistance. This brevity, this short form, is also, of course, a way of resisting the Soviet norm in the Soviet period, at least. Well, I think there would be much more to say, but
Thank you, Yelena. Any other questions? And while the people are thinking of question, I have a it's not a very theoretical thing. I was thinking about the film Spravka, the test, exactly in terms of ethical situation, because I was scanning all the films from that point of view, and I didn't quite caught this film, in fact, because for those who don't know, Eugénie explained that the man is coming to get an attest for his dead mother, although the mother is not dead. So he returns back home and he knocks on the door, and that's the end of the film. And she said, he calls Mama. Yeah. And I was thinking maybe he is planning to kill her. What do you know about that?
Oh, I never thought about that. I thought it was just pure administrative kind of.
It is administrative. I think maybe kind of a reversal of cause and effect. So he already planned to do that. So he got all the formalities first.
Yeah, maybe you are right, absolutely. On this topic, I was actually quite interested in the, well, it's a continuation of your talk, actually, but about this ethical thing. For instance, in The Tuner, which is the feature film of Spravka, I think there is something very powerfully ethical in the way Muratova stops showing the people who manipulated the old ladies once they've finished their forfeit. So, well, that's how I sense it. I was wondering when I was listening to you, because, for instance, you were quoting a paper about Dexter. When we watch Dexter, the more we watch it, the more we don't really know what is the position of the director. I mean, what are they really shocked, appalled, against it? With Muratova, we always know. How come?
You think we know is Muratova?
I think we know. No, you don't think so?
No, I don't think so. So anyway, Spravka is, she called it an offshoot or an offspring of the Tuner. So we can always see those films together as a pair.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was supposed to be a sequence from the Tuner, but it didn't fit inside. And finally it worked as an independent short film.
Any questions in the Zoom? Lila Kaganovsky. Yes, Lila. You can unmute yourself and speak. We will.
I think, yeah. Thank you. You can hear me, yeah?
Yes.
So I always have a question, of course. You know, I was curious, the way that you were just talking, Zhenya, a little bit later about the Muratova's practice, it sounded Eisensteinian, right? It sounded like the sort of the blocks, the kind of contrapuntal, you know, image versus sound, right? Things, the point is not to have things mix, right? The point is to have them clash and shock and do all of that. I mean, I don't know if it's a question or an observation or something that you want to follow up on, but anyways, that is she thinking of sort of montage in that same way that Eisenstein would have thought of it, or does she have a different system, do you think?
Oh, thank you for your question, your comment. It's really very, very interesting. Well, what I think is the difference between Muratova and Eisenstein is that Eisenstein has this idea of opus magnum. He has this, he draws in advance everything, and she's on the opposite of that. She doesn't want to know exactly where she will finish up, so because she will get bored otherwise. But I absolutely agree. I do think that her cinema is much more connected actually to the years 1920s, at least, than to the some of the directors that are who work at the same time as her. And I think this is one of the reasons why she was so hard to receive outside of the Soviet and post-Soviet context, because she is really very far from Tarkovsky, for instance. Okay, and she's much more, I think, in this kind of clashing universe that would be the 20s in painting, in sound, in direction, in film. So I do think it's completely correct.
So I'm sorry for my English. I tried. So, thank you very much for your talk. Your idea about the production process which you describe underlines also the idea of Michael Niehaus, the idea of a contingency as a aesthetical and production strategy of auteur cinema. But it's on a remark. My note is I have an association of the dissonance with Dissens of Jacques Rancière. Mm-hmm. It is also a political function of the art, not chaos, but an order, to produce an order and disturb the norm.
Yes, thank you very much, Irina. Yes, I'm sorry because I did not understand the paper, so I'm happy to know a little bit. I was guessing bits of it from the illustrations, but that was all. Yes, absolutely. And I do think that's one of the things I suggest actually in my book, that there is that Muratova suggests a new order. So it's not just the disorder. There is the disorder, and she loves chaos, and she says that chaos is magnificent, completely in harmony with what Irina was saying about this first glance when you don't know yet. She said chaos is the universe where the rules of beauty are not created yet. So everything is to invent. So she really loved it. But of course, at some point she proposes an order, and it is a different order, a non-hierarchical order, which is quite shocking in the Soviet context, of course, where the symbolism and the narration and the traditional narration are completely king at the time. So it is political in a sense. I talk about a serial order. So the order that would be, well, I was also talking earlier about fractal order, you could say. Okay, so this order where every element is as important as all the others. And so this creates this image of a very heterogeneous, huge universe you cannot cover with your thought, but you can still respect every element of it in some way. So it's completely political, of course, because it's an alternative point of view from the classical one, and I'm talking about the Soviet context, but it still applies in her late films. As we could even say that I think Вечное возвращение, it's also almost a political gesture, because taking what is supposed to be thrown away, which is the cuts of the film that will never be made. Of course, it's a fictional invention, but still, and saying this will make the film, this is the heart of the film. It's a very, also, I think, strong statement.
In any way, this eternal homecomings, which is translated in Russian, actually eternal return.
Yes, I translated eternal return.
Yes, me too.
Yes, in English, I'm sorry.
But I like eternal return much more. But in a way, it's a sort of a meta model of filmmaking, including this brevity, the repetition, this brief form. That's what you were talking about. I'm glad you came to that. Yeah. Anything else?
Jane Talman.
Jane.
Hi, can you hear me from way over here?
Yes.
Okay, this may be a totally bizarre and off-topic answer, but I am the mother and a grandmother of two young men who have attentional deficit disorder. And as you kept reading all of those quotations from Muratova about how I get bored, I want to change, I get bored, I kept hearing my grandson. So that may be totally off the wall, but I leave it there for whatever it's worth.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jane. Actually, we're kind of laughing with Irina Schulzki, because she was talking just before about this kind of perception of the world, which would be autistic or Asperger or something like this. So I think definitely, I don't know if really Muratova was anything like this, but it's clear that she so strongly challenges our usual cinema perception that we have to kind of find an explanation for it, or kind of try to understand what's going on. I'm sorry, I will again say the same story I already told, I think, after Lida's paper in June or in May. I don't cinema. It's very, it's in some ways it's hyper realistic. Mm-hmm. So when you say again, it's the perception before intellection, it's very accurate. When you record, yes, also, of course, when you record just a conversation of people around a table and you listen to it, it's Muratova. Mm-hmm. So what happens in classical traditional feature films is that the soundtrack is completely cleaned out so that we can follow what is going on. But this is the kind of really what's going on in the sound space when we leave. So is it a different perception, or is it just a way of making us conscious of that and making us pay attention to the fact that the world is that kind of disorder, chaos, and contingency? We don't know. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane.
Can you hear me, or is my hand down? Can I add one little thing? Yes, can you hear me, or? Okay. What you were just saying reminds me of the description of what the view of an ADD person is. And it's of 13 TV channels coming in all at the same time.
And I think that makes a lot of sense with what Zhenya was saying about lack of selection, right? Mm-hmm. That there's a way in which Muratova refuses to choose. So she refuses to choose. She refuses to prioritize the sound on a soundtrack, one character over another, right? All of the things that normally you write one take over another. All of these things. I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it.
Yes, I'm trying to raise my hand, but I just cannot find the button.
We're listening.
Yeah, I want to continue what Jane was mentioning. It's absolutely fascinating direction that kind of developed from this idea of Muratova not selecting, and I think it's brings us to this idea of parallel realities that I kind of never connected to Muratova previously, but through this discussion, and this kind of multiplicity of realities, and those realities are not like far off, but actually, like, you know, this matrix glitch realities that like you repeat and there is something off, but it's almost like normal reality, and that, that it merges at some point. And the idea of like HDD having 13 channels, we all have many channels. We just maybe manage to filter them. So it's not really HDD, it's like the nature of reality. And this is, I think, really a fascinating way to approach Muratova's repetitiveness. It's like to point to us that there are many channels simultaneously in our reality. And maybe that would bring us away from the more like, you know, destructive version of Muratova that was established through the Soviet film criticism and then kind of followed her, to the more creative version that she's like more expanding the consciousness. But back to boredom, I think that boredom comes from Soviet experience, and that's not really the HDD version, because Soviet experience was extremely boring. It was like production of boredom, and I think Katie Chekhovian has recently wrote a book about it. It was a very filtered reality, a reality where very few things were allowed to exist. And it was like extremely sense-deprived reality, which in a sense gave the, I guess, boost to this, attitude that Muratova had. And that's an interesting point to think. And thank you for wonderful presentation and discussion.
Thank you for your comment. I really love it. About I completely agree that what I think is so endearing about Muratova's cinema is that it's fun, actually. Once you've passed this kind of shock of the chaos and disorder and what's happening all at the same time, and I have to kind of remake all the things I do subconsciously in my everyday life, because I'm again presented with the chaos of the world and I have to make my way through it. It's really fun. The excerpt I showed, of course, you can just suffer in front of it, like, oh, again. But clearly, that's not what she expects, and that's not what she suggests to you. It's like, а можно так, а можно так, а можно еще вот так. And so it's kind of that's the plentiful of the plentiful aspect of the world, absolutely. So it's so rich. Let's play and see how diverse and rich it is.
I was also thinking about when you talk about this film, about Chekhovian motives. Actually, the brevity in this film it evokes boredom. In fact, which should be the contrary.
Actually, in this film, it's very interesting because I rewatched it for this paper, and I was shocked that the first part is so short. I remembered it as much longer because a lot happens in it, and it's actually like 20 minutes. I think it's very, very short. And the rest of it, it's just a very short action, which is just the marriage, but it's completely, so there she really wanted to depict boredom, I think. It's the religion.
Jampolsky also wrote about it, that because she filmed the marriage in the church in the full length entirely. So it's just to put the viewer in this situation of boredom.
Yes. I think it's the only time when she does this, the real time thing.
Thank you so much for your discussion. Thank you for your talk, Eugénie.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you to people online.
Stop recording.